Let me tell you what you're actually looking at when you see a No Kings protest. You are looking at an industry. A professionally staffed, institutionally funded, nationally coordinated mobilization machine that has been built over years specifically to manufacture the appearance of spontaneous grassroots outrage on demand. It has pre-scheduled national protest dates. It has legal teams ready to deploy. It has communications infrastructure, digital organizing tools, volunteer training programs, and they had a flagship event on March 28th of 2026, a date that was on the calendar before most Americans had even heard of the incident it claims to be responding to. It has 200 partner organizations, including the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, the Democratic Socialists of America, the American Federation of Teachers, Move On, and the Human Rights Campaign. And it has George Soros, whose Open Society Foundations gave the primary organizer, an outfit called Indivisible, $7.6 million in grants between 2017 and 2023, including $3 million in grants in 2023, specifically to support what the foundation's own records describe as civic engagement infrastructure and data tools. They want you to think it's organic. They want you to think it's spontaneous. They want you to believe that the same protest movement that mobilized on June 14th, October 18th, and is scheduled again, and again, and again, and again, is a genuine independent uprising of concerned citizens who just happen to show up with identical messaging, professional legal support, coordinated national communications, and standardized safety briefings in 2,700 locations simultaneously. They want you to believe that the Los Angeles riots, where protesters threw fireworks and rocks at federal officers, looted businesses, blocked freeways, and forced the deployment of 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines at a cost of $134 million taxpayer dollars, were an organic community response to injustice rather than the predictable product of years of deliberate radicalization and professional mobilization infrastructure. They are counting on most people being too busy, too tired, and too distracted to connect the dots. Today, I'm going to connect them. I follow the money, examine the violence, document the ideology, map out the endgame, and ask the question the corporate media will not ask. Who is running this permanent revolution? Why? And what do they actually want America to look like when they're done?
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to awaken America.
The infrastructure is the story the left suppresses most aggressively, because the infrastructure exposes the lie. The narrative they need you to believe is simple. Millions of ordinary Americans alarmed by the Trump administration have spontaneously taken to the streets in the largest protest movement in American history. That narrative is not entirely false. Many of the people who show up to these rallies are genuine and sincere, and not on anyone's payroll. But the machinery that gets them there, that coordinates the messaging, provides the legal support, selects the dates, builds the national communications apparatus, does not run on sincerity. It runs on money. And the money has a paper trail. The primary organizer of the No Kings movement is Indivisible, a progressive network founded the day after Donald Trump won the 2016 election. According to IRS Form 990 filings, Indivisible reported $12.6 million in revenue for fiscal year 2023 alone. George Soros's Open Society Foundations contributed $7.6 million to Indivisible between 2017 and 2023. Affiliates of Arabella Advisors, a DC-based consultancy that manages a web of left-wing dark money funds, directed $114.8 million between 2019 and 2023 to 31 progressive partner organizations that provide advocacy infrastructure, legal support, and event coordination. The 1630 Fund, one of the Arabella's primary vehicles, received and distributed hundreds of millions of dollars in donor anonymous contributions to progressive organizations during this same period. The donors are not disclosed. The political objectives are. Now, a precision point. Because this show does not traffic in exaggerations that can be used against us. The viral claim that $300 million went directly to fund the No Kings protests specifically is not what the documented records show. The money that flowed to Indivisible and its partner organizations was not line item budgeted for any single event. What the records do show, and this is the argument that holds up under scrutiny, is that a permanent political mobilization infrastructure, professionally funded and institutionally staffed, has been built and maintained over years and is being continuously deployed. That infrastructure does not disappear between protest dates. It runs year-round, expanding capacity, training volunteers, developing digital tools, building the operational backbone that makes it possible to turn out millions of people in 2,700 locations on a single day. A machine that can do that does not spring into existence when a triggering incident occurs. It exists before the trigger. It is waiting for the trigger. And when the trigger arrives, the machine deploys. The June 14th date was not accidental. It was chosen to coincide with the United States Army's 250th anniversary parade in Washington and with Donald Trump's birthday. The October 18th date was the announced second wave, promoted nationally in advance. March 28th, 2026 is already live with volunteer training materials and digital organizing resources, with the stated trigger being immigration enforcement incidents in Minnesota. In each case, the infrastructure was already operational before the trigger event happened. That is not a protest movement. That is a standing army in civilian clothing funded by billionaires, deployed by professional organizers, and aimed at the permanent destabilization of a government that was elected by the American people. Senator Ted Cruz introduced legislation, the Stopped Funders Act, that would allow the DOJ to apply RICO statuses against individuals who fund violent protests. That legislation exists because members of Congress have examined this funding infrastructure and found it alarming enough to require a federal response. A democracy in which one side has a professionally funded permanent mobilization machine and the other side has nothing equivalent is not a democracy in balance. It is a democracy being systematically gamed by people with very deep pockets and very specific goals. Here's what happens when the mobilization machine produces actual violence And it does produce violence, not at every location, not from every participant, but consistently enough and seriously enough that the refusal on the left's political and media establishment to honestly confront it is itself a political act. Los Angeles, June 2025, ICE agents conducted immigration enforcement operations in downtown Los Angeles. Protests began the same day. Within 48 hours, those protests had become riots in part of downtown. Protesters threw fireworks, rocks, and glass bottles directly at LAPD officers. A Waymo autonomous vehicle was set on fire in the street. Businesses were looted and vandalized across multiple neighborhoods. Mayor Karen Bass declared a state of emergency and imposed a curfew. The unrest spread to Paramount and Compton, where crowds gathered on rumors of ICE activity and had to be dispersed with tear gas and flashbangs. By the time the military deployment peaked, the Los Angeles area had 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines from 29 Palms operating on American streets at a total cost to the American taxpayers of approximately $134 million. Governor Gavin Newsom called the federal military response deranged and illegal and filed suit in federal court to stop it. Mayor Karen Bass said the city was being used for an experiment by the federal government. Democrats in Congress framed the story as one of federal overreach, not of the people through commercial fireworks at police. The national media followed that framing, with significant coverage devoted to the legal dispute between Newsom and the Trump administration, and minimal sustained attention to the looting, the arson, or the $134 million price tag. The business owners whose storefronts were destroyed disappeared from the narrative. The taxpayers billed for the cleanup disappeared. The officers who went home with injuries disappeared. The rioters became the victims. The government that restored order became the villain. This is the pattern. It is consistent and it is deliberate. When protest infrastructure produces violence, the violence gets reframed as a response to injustice. The people who lit things on fire become the real story only when it's unavoidable. And even then, the framing centers their grievances rather than their actions. The political leaders who refuse to condemn the violence loudly and clearly become voices of reason being suppressed by federal power. And the machine continues running. Minnesota added another chapter in January of 2026, following the fatal shooting of a woman named Renee Good by an ICE agent. Thousands marched through Minneapolis in sub-zero temperatures. 700 businesses closed in a general strike. A week later, following another immigration enforcement death, a broader national shutdown and economic blackout was called by university labor unions. As of March 11th, 2026, 334 student walkouts specifically targeting ICE have been logged this year alone. The pipeline runs from professional funding infrastructure to campus activism to street protests to economic disruption, and it's running continuously. Woven through all of it is a tolerance for physical intimidation and violence that the mainstream press persistently underreports. The same movement that held candlelit vigils mourning Ayatollah Khomeini. The supreme leader of a regime that executed gay men, sponsored terrorism for 47 years, and chanted death to America as official state policy since 1979, celebrates when members of Trump's administration face personal threats. The Rutgers University poll showing that 55% of left-of-center Americans believe murdering Donald Trump is at least somewhat justified is not an anomaly. It is the logical product of a movement that has spent years telling its followers that the stakes are so existential, the enemy so monstrous, that ordinary mortal constraints do not apply. When you build that argument long enough and loudly enough, your followers believe you, and then they act on it. The protests are the visible surface. The ideology is the engine, and the ideology of the modern American left has drifted so far from anything recognizable as traditional American liberalism that the word liberal no longer describes it accurately. The immigration protests make the clearest picture. The argument the organizers are actually making, not the polite version deployed for swing voters, but the operational logic expressed through their tactics, is not that immigration laws should be reformed through the democratic process. It is that immigration laws should not be enforced at all. The riots in Los Angeles were not demanding legislative change. They were physically obstructing federal officers from executing lawful orders. The general strikes in Minnesota were not aimed at Congress. They were aimed at making ICE enforcement operationally impossible through mass disruption and economic pressure. 334 student walkouts targeted not a policy debate, but a law enforcement agency doing its constitutionally authorized job. This is a fundamentally revolutionary posture. It says these laws are unjust. Therefore, we will not permit them to be enforced, and we will use mass disruption, property destruction, and economic warfare to stop them. If the right applied that logic to laws it opposed, refusing to permit their enforcement through riots and strikes and shutdowns, the word used would not be protest. The word used would be insurrection. The foreign policy posture reveals even more. When American and Israeli forces killed Ayatollah Khomeini, groups in New York City held vigils for him. Vigils for the leader of a regime that has sponsored terrorism for 5 decades, that executed political dissidents, that funded the groups that killed American soldiers in Iraq and Syria, that has chanted death to America as official state policy since 1979. Protests labeled the Iran strikes an illegal act of war. Demonstrations demanded reduced military support for Ukraine. Rallies condemned the capture of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro as imperialist regime change. At every single foreign policy inflection point since January 2025, the organized left has positioned itself in opposition to American national interests and in sympathy with America's adversaries. This is not the foreign policy of a loyal political opposition with different strategic priorities. It is the foreign policy of a movement that begins from the premise that American power in the world is inherently illegitimate and that our adversaries are the genuine victims of our aggression. Underneath all of the specific positions is the everything is Trump's fault arrangement that functions as the movement's theological glue. Since January 20th, 2025, the left has attributed to the Trump administration responsibility for a list of developments so vast and so disconnected from rational political analysis that it constitutes a collective break from ordinary cause and effect thinking. Gas prices, the behavior of foreign governments, the emotional distress of their children, the ideology of radical terrorists, climate events, every institutional failure at every level of government. The reflex is automatic and total. Whatever is wrong, Trump did it. Trump caused it. Trump is responsible. This is not political analysis. It's persecution narrative functioning as a substitute religion. And it does what all persecution narratives do. It removes the need for honest self-examination, eliminates accountability, and makes the escalation of rage not just justified, but righteous. This is also why they can't hold a conversation. The ideology is to find disagreement as violence. You are not someone with a different view. You are a threat. You are complicit. You are on the wrong side of history, which in the left's theological framework means you are on the wrong side of a moral judgment from which there is no appeal. There is no debate to be had with someone who occupies that position. There is only confrontation, denunciation, and the performance of correct belief for the approval of the tribe. Every week brings a new radical ideological position, a new approved grievance, a new enemy to denounce. Not because the left is genuinely discovering new injustices at this pace, but because the machine requires constant activation. Rage without a fresh target goes cold, and cold rage does not generate donations, volunteer hours, or protest attendance. So the machine produces a new outrage on schedule every week like clockwork. Here's the question that cuts through everything else. If this movement got everything it wanted, if the permanent revolution succeeded, if the resistance won, if the machine achieved its goals, what would America actually look like? The answer is not hidden. They tell you. You just have to listen past the talking points and look at the actual policy agenda being advanced by the people who fund and run this infrastructure. On immigration, the end game is the functional elimination of national borders as an enforceable legal construct, not reform, not a pathway to citizenship with conditions attached. The operational goal, expressed through the tactics of the movement, is a country in which the federal government cannot determine who enters, cannot remove those who enter illegally, and cannot even collect the data necessary to enforce its own laws. The Green Light Law in New York, which prohibiting the DMV from sharing records with ICE, costing ICE access to data it had used to arrest 149 child predators and rescue 105 trafficking victims in a single year, is not an outlier. It is the template. The end game is a country where the distinction between citizen and non-citizen has no legal or practical meaning, where national sovereignty is treated as a form of bigotry, and where any attempt to enforce the border is met with riots, strikes, and federal lawsuits filed by governors who are more loyal to the protest machine than to the Constitution they swore to uphold. On the economy, the agenda being advanced by the progressive infrastructure is not the mid-20th century liberal project of regulated capitalism with a robust safety net. It is the deliberate dismantling of the energy economy that powers this country, the elimination of the entire industry through regulatory warfare and political pressure, and the replacement of that private economic decision-making with state direction on a scale this country has never seen. They call it the Green New Deal. They call it a just transition. What it actually is, stripped of the branding, is a transfer of trillions of dollars in economic decision-making authority from private individuals and businesses to a federal bureaucracy staffed by people who hold exactly the ideology you've been watching in the streets. The fossil fuel workers of West Virginia and North Dakota and Texas are not a problem to be managed in this vision. They are an obstacle to be removed. Their communities are acceptable collateral damage in the project of building the world the left has decided the rest of us should live in. On institutions, the end game is the consolidation of power in the hands of the permanent administrative state and the insulation of that state from democratic accountability, packing the Supreme Court until it produces approved outcomes, eliminating the filibuster to remove the last check on simple majority rule, using federal funding as a lever to force ideological compliance in universities, hospitals, and corporations. The protest machine and the institutional power grab are not separate projects. They are a pincer movement. The streets generate pressure, the institutions absorb power. Together, they produce a political environment in which the elected government of the United States cannot actually govern because every decision it makes is met with coordinated legal, institutional, and street-level resistance funded by people who were never elected by anyone. On culture, the end game is the completion of the project you can already see in every university, every corporate diversity department, and every public school that has adopted the new orthodoxy. A culture in which biological sex is a social construct with no legal or institutional meaning, in which the traditional family is one lifestyle choice among many with no privileged status in law or culture, in which the Christian faith, and specifically the Christian moral framework that shaped Western civilization, is reclassified as a form of bigotry that must be driven from public life, in which the history of the United States is taught primarily as a story of oppression, in which gratitude for what this country has built and achieved is treated as either naivety or complicity, and in which the only acceptable posture toward American civilization is one of the perpetual critique and demanded transformation. That is the end game. Not a better America, a different one. One built on different premises, organized around different values, governed by different people. The people who are funding the machine and running the infrastructure and scheduling the protest dates and training the volunteers. They are not hiding it. They are telling you. You just have to be willing to hear it. Step back from the funding, the riots, the ideology, and the endgame for a moment, and look at what is actually powering all of it. because the protest industrial complex is not ultimately a political phenomenon. It's a spiritual one, and until you understand it that way, you're going to keep being surprised by its persistence, its intensity, and its immunity to rational argument. Human beings are built for meaning. We are built for community, for a shared story about who we are and what we're fighting for, and what is worth sacrificing for. For most of human history, that need was met by religious faith, imperfectly, corruptly at times, but structurally. A God who made the world and called it good, a human being made in his image, with inherent dignity that no government could create or revoke, a moral order that exists independent of whoever holds political power at a given moment. The modern left has spent decades systematically dismantling that framework in every institution it controls, universities, media, entertainment, corporate culture, and they've been replacing it with nothing durable. What fills the vacuum is exactly what you see in the streets. A movement with saints, the approved victims whose suffering must be ritualized and commemorated. A movement with heretics, anyone who questions the orthodoxy on race, gender, climate, immigration, or any other sacred categories. A movement with its own eschatology. The climate apocalypse, the rise of fascism, the permanent emergency always 2 minutes away from arriving. That functions exactly like religious end times theology and produces exactly the same moral license. When you believe civilization is always on the verge of collapse and the enemy is literally Hitler and the stakes are literally the survival of democracy, ordinary moral constraints feel not just obsolete, but dangerous. You cannot debate a Nazi. You can only stop him. That is the internal logic. That is why they cannot hold a conversation. That is why 55% of them told the Rutgers researcher that murdering the president is at least somewhat justified. The theology demands it. A religion with no grace and no redemption does not produce peace. It produces the permanent revolutionary whose identity is so thoroughly defined by oppression that he cannot exist without an enemy. The protest machine needs that person. It funds and trains and deploys that person. And then it calls what that person does democracy. But it's not democracy. It's the oldest story in the book. The story of what happens to human beings and human societies when the worship of God is replaced by the worship of an ideology. Every time that substitution has been made in history at scale, the results have been catastrophic. The ideology consumes its own. The revolution eats its children. The machine that promised liberation becomes the instrument of a new and more total oppression. The Christian answer to this is not a counter-protest movement. It's not a conservative version of the same mobilization machine. It's the patient, persistent, generational work of building families, communities, institutions, and cultures grounded in what is actually true. Schools that teach the full story of this country, its failures honestly acknowledged, and its extraordinary achievements genuinely celebrated. Churches that hold fast to what they believe without apology and without the desperation of institutions that have decided relevance matters more than truth. A politics grounded in the understanding that human beings are fallen, that power corrupts, that every institution requires checks, and that no ideology, not even one you agree with, should be trusted with unchecked authority over the lives of other people. That is the vision. Not a burning down, a building up. And it's available to everyone who is willing to do the work. Refuse the silence, speak what you see, name what the machine is, and then build something that lasts longer than the next scheduled protest date. Here is the complete picture. The American left has built a protest industrial complex. It's professionally funded. Indivisible alone reported $12.6 million in revenue in 2023, backed by George Soros's Open Society Foundations and dark money networks rooted through the Arabella Advisors affiliates. It's institutionally staffed, legally supported, and digitally organized. The protest dates are pre-scheduled. The messaging is standardized. The next mobilization is already live with training materials and organizing resources ready to deploy. This is not grassroots. This is infrastructure. This is a standing army in civilian clothing aimed at the permanent destabilization of an elected government. When that infrastructure produces violence, as it did in Los Angeles, where 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines were deployed at the cost of $134 million, the Democrat political establishment reframes the story as federal overreach, and the media follows the framing. The victims disappear. The rioters become the story. The machine keeps running. 334 student walkouts targeting ICE have been logged in 2026 alone. Vigils have been held for the supreme leader of the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. The Rutgers poll found that 55% of left-of-center Americans believe murdering the president is at least somewhat justified. And at every foreign policy inflection point, the organized left positions itself against American national interests and in favor of America's adversaries. The end game is not a better America. It's a different one. Open borders, dismantled energy economy, captured institutions insulated from democratic accountability, and a culture from which the Christian moral framework has been systematically expelled. They're not hiding it. The machine is built to achieve it. And the only thing standing between that vision and its execution is an informed, engaged, vocal citizenry that refuses to be silenced or distracted or exhausted into compliance. That is what this show is here to build. One episode, one conversation, one truth told out loud at a time. Before we go, I need to ask for your support. This show runs on you, not on Soros money, not on dark money networks, not on foundation grants from billionaires who want to shape the information environment. Just you, the listener, who understands that independent media willing to name what it sees is worth fighting for. What you heard today? The Indivisible funding trail, the Los Angeles riots, the 334 student walkouts, the Kamini vigils, the end game they're not bothering to hide. You're not going to hear it assembled this clearly anywhere else. Corporate media is not following this money. They're not connecting these dots. We are. And we can only keep doing it because of listeners like you. Check us out at TITDUSA.com and the Stand Against the Silence campaign. If you're already a subscriber, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Share this episode. That's how this network grows. Find us on YouTube, search Courage in the Darkness. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Patreon, and now we're on Rumble. Subscribe wherever you listen. Their machine is funded by billionaires. Ours is funded by you. And that makes all the difference. Stand with us, support the mission, refuse the silence, and I'll see you next time.